Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program where we examine why the political system is dysfunctional and polarized. And in each show, we try and offer a solution of how we're going to fix this. For those of you who may have seen some shows lately, or I guess regardless if you have or not, one of the things that's really been bugging me a lot for the last year or two is the lack of civil discourse in the process. As I've mentioned many times, if you look historically, polarization exists frequently. The question is, can you overcome polarization and get to compromise? We can't in today's society. We can't in today's Congress. But if you can't have civil discourse and you can't talk to each other, you can never hope to get to compromise. So you end up with polarization and dysfunction. So I'm thinking about that topic. This week is always a fun week for me because it's the Aspen Ideas Festival. And because of the Aspen Ideas Festival, I get to find all these really exciting people who are guests that can come and visit with us. We've got an echo here, Jeremy. We're going to have to start over.
I'm so sorry. That's my phone live streaming.
Nadine's running her
I don't
show
want
over there.
I'm so sorry. Can you just turn it off?
You're fired.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You know how to turn it off?
Yep.
Why did it do that?
Oh, you just had it on YouTube still.
Oh, I'm so
and so
sorry.
that you were actually hearing.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
You were hearing yourself live.
I'm so
not
sorry.
a good thing.
Is it off now?
We're starting over. Don't worry.
I'm so sorry to make you.
Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program where we examine why the political system and government is dysfunctional and polarized. And in each show, we try and talk about solutions. And beyond that, we try and talk about how you can get involved and how you can help make the system better. Of late, I've been very concerned with the tone of the civil discourse, in fact, lack of any civil discourse in our system. People don't talk with each other, they talk at each other, and relatively speaking, they talk past each other. And this is very concerning to me. I know politics is often polarized, but you can overcome polarization if you can find compromise and you can work together and you can get solutions. Very hard to get solutions if you can't talk to each other and you have no path for discourse. So this is a fun week of the year for us. It's the Aspen Ideas Festival, and I always look through the list and figure out who I want to try and sneak onto the show. And this year I found Nadine Strassen, and she's written a book on hate speech. Now, hate speech is a little bit past civil discourse, but I think it's in the realm here, and most of the time, quite frankly, I think we verge on hate speech. Now, it may not be hate speech that rises to an offense that violates the Constitution, but it's not solving problems here. So I thought we'd have Nadine on the show, talk about her book on hate speech, and see if we can come up with some solutions. That's what we do.
I'd like to. Thank you
Nadine,
so much.
welcome to the show, and we're going to put a picture of the book on the screen when we broadcast it locally, so we'll have a good sales pitch for you.
Thank you so much.
And in fact, I will forget to do this at the end, so tell the viewers now, how are they going to buy your book?
Any way you usually buy books, if you like to listen to books, as I do myself, I had the great honor of recording my book for Audible.com. You can also buy it at your local independent bookstore, of which I know there are wonderful ones here in Aspen. And you can, of course, buy it online from either Oxford University Press, Amazon, or whoever your favorite online supplier is.
Awesome. So we're going to make our viewers all buy the book. So, you can
also borrow it from your local public library, I hasten to add, as a big library supporter.
So it's not like you just wake up one day and say, I'm going to write a book on hate speech, right?
It was festering for quite a long time,
yeah,
Nemo.
So talk about the festering.
Well, this is an issue that is a recurrent issue throughout my adult lifetime. So first of all, the term hate speech, and I'll use air quotes just once, and then your viewers can imagine that every time I use that term, because it is not a legally recognized recognized term of art. The Supreme Court has never defined a category of speech, labeled it hate speech, and said it's unprotected by the First Amendment's free speech guarantee. So it's different, for example, from obscenity,
I'll know when I see it.
Exactly, which is a subcategory of sexual expression that the Supreme Court has defined, and it says if the speech satisfies that definition, it's constitutionally unprotected. But you are referring to a very important line from a Supreme Court decision on obscenity, which really applies to hate speech as well, which is
the only thing I remember from constitutional law, that line.
It summarizes a lot. So former Justice Potter Stewart, in an obscenity case, said, I cannot define it, but I know it when I see it. And the problem is everybody sees a different it. So many of us think that the obscenity exception is wrong. And in fact, many Supreme Court justices have argued that it should be abolished. But fortunately, they've never created a hate speech exception, which presents the very same problems. Hate is an emotion. By definition, it's impossible to come up with an objective set of criteria. One person's hate speech is somebody else's cherished speech. So, and you think about how that term is bandied about in today's non-civil discourse. I was thinking about that during your excellent introduction. Basically, anytime somebody strongly disagrees with an idea or a person, they sling out hate speech, and it's an epithet, and it stifles discussion rather than promoting discussion. So we saw on college campuses during the 2016 presidential campaign to even chalk the word Trump on a sidewalk was attacked as hate speech. Today, people who dislike the critique that Black Lives Matter protesters are raising against police abuses say Black Lives Matter is hate speech. And some people have said, including some Black Lives Matter activists, that Blue Lives Matter is hate speech or all lives matter is hate speech. Most heartbreakingly to me, as a strong defender of the First Amendment and free speech, the term free speech itself has been denounced as hate speech on some campuses and elsewhere because they associate it with alt-right or white supremacist views that they dislike. So my book set out to explain not only why the United States Supreme Court has decided that there is not going to be categorical exclusion from the First Amendment just because a message is hated or hateful, and why those decisions are for the benefit of everyone, including those of us who hate the hateful ideas and are crusading for equal justice and human rights and dignity and equality every day. And I'm happy to say my book quotes so many human rights activists throughout history. In the United States, for example, every warrior for racial justice has also been a crusader against censorship. You know, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, the NAACP. Part of the reason why all of them opposed giving the government the power to silence hate speech is that their own ideas were denounced as hate speech. In their time, they were seen as offensive and insulting and defamatory and dangerous and subversive. So I think, you know, there are a lot of problematic things that people say. We do have to resist hate, and that's the only verb in my book, right? We must resist. But the most effective resistance is the one that comes through non-censorship strategies, including more speech, debate, and the kind of discourse that you so effectively champion.
But I take it this has kind of been your life. I mean, you were very involved in the ACLU, you've been a professor at New York Law School, you're a constitutional scholar. This has been your life. But you just don't wake up one day and say, now's the time to write the book. I think some of it goes back to the campus unrest that you
and you're
were saying,
right.
correct?
Sorry, I didn't answer your original question.
You weren't going to get off. I was going to make you answer the question.
So my entire adult lifetime, I've had to make this case because it is so hard for people to understand the underlying principle that's at stake. They say, oh, why is the ACLU defending the Nazis? And this goes back to the late 1970s when I had just gotten out of law school, and the ACLU was defending freedom of speech for American neo-Nazis who wanted to demonstrate in Skokie, Illinois.
I'm from Chicago. I lived through that case.
And you know, to this day, when you say Skokie, it has become emblematic for robust free speech, even for the idea that we hate, to quote Oliver Wendell Holmes. So here you have the nation's premier civil liberties organization that has been crusading throughout its entire existence for civil rights and against the ideas that the Nazis are purveying, nonetheless defending their right to spew those ideas. And that was so controversial, Nemo, that the ACLU lost 15% of our members. Even people who are such diehard free speech supporters that they become card-carrying ACLU members said, we want to draw the line here. And then, as you mentioned, about 10 to 15 years later, we have, I hasten to add, we resoundingly won the Skokie case in the courts of law, because it's what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of our freedom of speech, viewpoint neutrality, that government may never censor speech merely because its viewpoint is despised or feared or loathed or hated. But it's always controversial in the court of public opinion. So a dozen or so years later, there's this new movement for hate speech codes on college campuses. Very serious arguments were made, including by people who had been civil liberties supporters, saying, look, ACLU, you are always working for non-discrimination on campus, for getting campuses that had traditionally excluded or marginalized women and racial minorities to let down the barriers, but it's not true equality if they are still subject to hateful speech. So the ACLU actually re-examined our position. Didn't matter that we had advocated it since we were founded and way back in 1920. I mean, every organization who is devoted to freedom should not hesitate to freely re-examine even the most tried and true principles. As a result of that re-examination, we again resoundingly reaffirmed our traditional position, but we explained it more fully. You know, as John Stuart Mill in his famous essay on liberty says, one of the reasons why every idea should be subject to challenge is even if you first of all, you might change your mind. Secondly, even if you don't, you're revisiting it and revitalizing it and appreciating it with new dynamism. So that really happened. And we spelled out how even though those who were advocating hate speech codes were doing so with the most noble of intentions, and we certainly supported the goals of meaningful equality on college campuses, that in the end, no matter how well-intentioned, these hate speech codes would do more harm than good to equality as well as to free speech. And now, again, I would say starting around 2014, 2015, with the recent resurgence of activism on college campuses, on behalf of causes that I so enthusiastically support: racial justice, justice in the criminal injustice system, against sexual violence, for immigrants' rights, LGBT rights, and so forth. So all of that is really positive, and as a campus activist from the 60s and 70s, I'm so grateful to see today's young students be again reviving that kind of activism that we hadn't seen in a long time. But we've seen not only actual incidents of speech suppression, including through violence and through shouting down and shutting down and censorship and disinvitations, but we've seen many public opinion surveys that show that today's college students don't think that hateful ideas and insulting ideas should be constitutionally protected. So even though I'd made these arguments many, many times before, by definition, I had failed to persuade, and not taking it all on myself, I and others who shared my view clearly had not persuaded too many people today. So I thought I'm going to try again, and I hope I have been more persuasive.
So who's the audience for the book? Who are you writing for?
I'm writing for anybody who's not already a true believer in my bottom line conclusion that no matter who you are and no matter what you believe, you are benefited by a robust freedom of speech that is robust enough that it extends to hated and hateful ideas. Moreover, if you are a member of any kind of minority group, including a political minority, racial minority, or so forth, you have a particularly great stake in robust freedom of speech, because by definition, you're never going to have majority power. So you especially depend on free speech to advocate your cause.
I'm an old parliamentarian, and the theory of parliamentary process is that the minority has a right to speak, and then the majority has the right to outvote them. And there's a nice balance there.
Exactly.
But the minority must be allowed to make their case.
That's a really good analogy.
And your point is these laws can backfire, and then the uses of censorship tools and minorities don't get to make.
And
their
it's
case.
not even backfiring; that's the forward firing, right?
Firing.
By definition, you and Nemo, here I give many examples in my book of hate speech laws around the world in other countries, and including democratic countries, hate speech laws in the United States before the Supreme Court struck them down as unconstitutional. And the consistent pattern is that they are disproportionately used to silence not only minority voices in terms of political dissidents and dissenters, but also, tragically, the very racial, ethnic, demographic, sexual orientation, etc., minorities that were intended to be protected. And that is absolutely predictable when you look at the premises of those who advocate these laws. And I accept their premises. They say we still have too much discrimination and bias in this country. Amen. We have endemic, systemic bias entrenched in the criminal justice system and the civil justice system. Yes, we do. Studies show that none of us as an individual is immune from unconscious bias, sometimes called implicit bias. Sadly, that's true. We can overcome it. That's the good news. But why in the world would you then give to a government which we know has enforced drug laws and other criminal laws in ways that are discriminatory, particularly against young, dark-skinned men? Why would you hand to these biased systems and individuals a power that's even more subjective and discretionary than the power to pick and choose which hateful messages should be suppressed?
No, I told them I'm a lobbyist, and I approach my lobbying career differently than other lobbyists do. They just have an assignment, they implement it, and they're gone. And I spend time thinking about these kind of consequences. If you pass this particular law and you're solving this problem today, what are other unintended consequences of this law? And you have to examine that. But we're so dysfunctional, we can't even get laws passed, let alone think about unintended consequences. So let's do, you're our professor. I do at least want to do a quick educational moment here. And let's explain to the viewers. Under the Constitution, there are scenarios under which hate speech can be outlawed or censored. But it's very narrow, right? So explain those circumstances.
Okay, so as I already said, we have this sacrosanct viewpoint neutrality principle. Hate speech may never be censored merely because of its viewpoint, its content. However, if we go beyond content to context, speech with a hateful message, along with speech with any other content, may be punished if, but only if, in a particular context, it directly causes certain specific, imminent, serious harm, and there's no other way to prevent the harm other than through punishing the speech. So good examples would include intentional incitement of imminent violence that's likely to happen imminently. Another good example is what the courts call a...
And in your book, don't you give an example of someone who they're walking down the street and he says something intended to cause people to go across the street and attack someone?
Yeah,
so that's clearly a case of not protected speech.
Exactly, and
Okay.
thank you for giving that example, which came from a Supreme Court case. Another example is what the courts call a true threat, to distinguish it from the way we use threat in everyday speech rather loosely. So we have college students saying, I feel threatened by the fact that Milo has been invited to my campus. No, no, no. But a true threat that is not protected is when the speaker means to instill a reasonable fear in the person or small group of persons at whom the speech is directly targeted. And reasonable means that it's not just subjective, a thin-skinned person. So let me give you an example of that, which does come from a college campus, is in my book. About a year ago, a woman named Taylor Dumpson had been elected as the first African-American female student body president at American University. On the date that she was going to take office, distributed around campus were a series of bananas in nooses, and written on the bananas were the initials of her sorority, which is a predominantly African-American sorority. Clearly, that was meant to instill a reasonable fear.
We're not going to protect that.
We're not going to protect that.
But as you point out in the book, though, you know certain cases that you're not going to protect. But it's really hard to write this in a way, and you can draw the line. So one of the things that troubles you is the exercise of writing these laws, and how difficult it is to actually define this in an appropriate way and get to the core of it without capturing a lot more than you want to capture.
I say, my point, Steve, is that Nemo, is that if you go...
Steve, Nemo,
okay, I like Nemo, it's so cute, it's more unusual. If you go beyond the exceptions that the Supreme Court has now carved out, which are related to the effects of the speech, and not to the viewpoint of the speech. So if you either say, well, we are going to say some viewpoints are just so anathema to our values as Americans that we are just going to say you can't express that viewpoint, which a lot of countries have done. Or you say we're going to loosen up the causal connection, as we used to do. So, you know, now we say it has to directly and imminently cause specific serious harm. Earlier in our history, the court enforced what was called the harmful or bad tendency test. So if speech might indirectly at some point in the future lead to some bad consequences, that would be enough to punish it. And people who are advocating punishing hate speech in this country, they want to go back in that direction. And again, that's what other countries do. The danger from doing that is once you allow government this wider latitude, it's inevitably going to pick and choose ideas that it dislikes and punish those ideas. So when we had the looser bad tendency test, that's what was used to suppress civil rights demonstrators and demonstrators for women's suffrage and for reproductive freedom and any anti-war protesters and certainly anybody who had any left-wing viewpoints such as socialists and communists, because, well, they might lead to the overthrow of the United States government at some point in the future.
All right, so I want to get to solutions, because that's
Yeah.
what we talk about on our show, and you have solutions. But a real eye-opener in the book for me was you talked about going back to the 30s in Germany, pre-Hitler Germany. They had some of the toughest hate speech laws on the books, right?
And they were strictly enforced.
And that didn't stop what eventually occurred. So let's go to solutions, because you have a category you call counter speech. Mm-hmm. And this is where you want the emphasis to be, on counter speech. And there's gradations of counter speech. So walk us through counter speech, why that's the solution, and how we can use counter speech.
Absolutely. So that's a term that I and many lawyers use for any kind of exercise of our free speech rights to curb either the existence of hateful speech or, better yet, the attitudes that that speech reflects, and certainly to curb any actual discrimination or violence. And you know, how you use your free speech rights will depend on the context. So if you hear somebody spewing hateful ideas, you can debate that person. You can explain why those ideas are wrong. You can try to dissuade that person from continuing to adhere to the ideas, and hopefully members of the audience from adopting those ideas. You can go to somebody who is a member of a group that's being disparaged by the hateful speaker and show your support for and your solidarity for members of that group. You can advocate their equal rights and their full humanity and dignity. You can reach out with compassion and understanding and try to recruit hate mongers away from their hateful ideas. I'm so encouraged at the number of instances where that has occurred. In fact, one of the key people is going to be speaking at the Ideas Festival. His name is Christian Picciolini. He's written a book recently. He's done TED Talks. When he was a teenager, he was recruited into a hate group, and he became the leader of one of the most virulently vicious, violent, anti-minority skinhead groups. And through engagement with people who reached out to him with compassion, he left the movement. He formed an organization called Life After Hate, which has now recruited at least 100 people away, and each of them then has that ripple effect. And so there are many, many things we can do. I don't give up, but when we treat somebody who expresses a hateful idea as a criminal, which is what happens in Europe and Canada and Australia and around the world, that is not an effective way to change their ideas. And I find it ironic that so many liberals who are turning their back on the criminal justice system in other contexts and saying, you know, a punitive approach is not a constructive way to reintegrate somebody as a constructive member of our society. Why do they want to criminalize speech and ideas? That's also not constructive.
Yeah, I told you on the way over here, I agree with you, but I also disagree with you, but I wasn't going there on the show, and I'm not going to, but I do think you're right about the fact, and you don't talk about this enough in the book, decriminalizing it is a route. So you could still, there could be a penalty associated with it, but it doesn't have to be you go to jail penalty. Or maybe like a 3 strikes and you're out, you go to jail penalty kind of thing. I don't know.
But the other countries that I've studied which have used civil approaches as well, I find those equally unsatisfying.
All right, so time always flies on my show because we're having fun. Let's talk about one type of counter speech that I find very compelling. Let's just ignore them and give them the silent treatment.
Exactly.
Let's talk about that.
You know, so
and let them not become a martyr. Right?
Exactly.
Okay. Right.
And you know, no less an expert on hate groups than the Southern Poverty Law Center, whose whole mission is to monitor them, last year, before the beginning of the academic year, last summer, put out a guidance for college students because they knew that white supremacists were going to be recruiting on college campuses in record numbers, and they said to the students, you may find it morally satisfying to try to silence them, to shout them down, to disrupt them, but please resist that temptation. You are just playing into the trap that they are laying for you. You're giving them oxygen and attention that they otherwise would not have. Ignore them. They won't get the media attention, and their speech won't have a harmful impact.
And the media attention part of it, and you don't really get to that much in your book, I think it's very important here, that our media right now, they're so hungry for stories. They're so hungry to exploit whatever they can exploit. They love this stuff. So maybe you can get the students on the campus to not go on the attack, no matter what side. If you're a conservative, to not attack the liberals, liberals don't get it. And maybe on this campus you could get a truce call. But the media wants to sensationalize this. And I don't know how you're ever going to get the media to adopt the silent treatment. That's part of what's wrong with the whole system.
But we still defend free speech for the media, right?
Right. I mean, just an anecdote. I mean, I watch a lot of sports, and I know this is not about hate, but on sports, they'll agree, if someone runs on the field now, you don't show them running on the field because they ran on the field for attention. You know what I mean? So you just don't show that. So a lot of people stop running on the field because they weren't getting attention.
Or somebody commits a terrorist act or a school shooting. It's better not to give them the publicity if you want to.
Yeah, let's treat it in a tempered way and not I don't know, sensationalize it or whatever it is, and then get to the wrong place. Anyway, I knew we'd run out of time, but I want people to read your book. Again, it's called Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And for those of you in the audience, I know this is not an easy topic, and I haven't given a homework assignment in a long time, but I want you to pick a spot in this whole question of discourse, whether it's on some of the civil discourse shows we've had. We had Ted Celeste on to talk about his solutions. Or again, read what Nadine's written here about hate speech and think to yourself how we're going to get past this place where we are now and how we're going to be able to talk to each other again. Obviously, people that want to spew hate, we're not going to fix them per se, but
we might.
We might. But it's part of the larger conversation here that we've got to get our arms around. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.